Now, this afternoon we turn our attention to Plato, and in dealing with Plato, I want to follow the next couple of weeks this general format. We'll start with his epistemology, then look at his famous theory of forms, which of course is precisely what nominalism denies, then how all this bears on his understanding of God and the cosmos, then his understanding of the human soul, and finally the good life, ethics, social philosophy, etc. Now, to make the transition to Plato, let's cast our minds back into the pre-Socratics and the Sophists, where we've laid emphasis on two lines of thought that developed there. One has to do with that pre-scientific cosmology, the orderedness of nature as a whole, which for the Sophists, in their skepticism, raised questions about the possibility of knowing anything about the reality of what governs nature at all. And that epistemological question surfaces then because of the efforts at pre-scientific cosmology. The other line of thought we emphasized was the notion of moral order, the city-state and its proper ordering of justice, and the moral ordering of an individual's life. Now, that also raises epistemological questions, questions about moral knowledge. Can we really know objective truth in ethical matters? Or are we again caught in the competition between knowledge claims and mere opinion? Are there universal moral ideals, or are we left hanging in some relativistic situation in which every man is the measure of all things? Protagoras, you remember. So whether we take the scientific cosmology approach or the moral order approach, the same questions about knowledge versus skepticism develop in the Sophists, and of course in Socrates' attempt to counter the thinking of the Sophists. Now, Plato inherits that debate from Socrates, so that whether Plato is talking about the virtues, or about his major concern over the improvement of the soul, or whether he's talking about the ordering of the city-state in his political writings, or whether he's doing some things, as he does in a few places, on cosmology, the order of nature. In all of those areas, the same question arises. How can we know for sure? How can we get beyond relative varying opinions? And we see that the sort of direction which Socrates started, the alternatives of rhetoric versus dialectic, come into focus in Plato's thinking. Now, this week, you are reading Plato's Meno, among other dialogues. And that particular dialogue, the Meno, it gets right at the heart of this issue and helps you to see the way in which it's related to ethical matters. The overall question that the Meno focuses on is the question that people still ask, I guess every parent asks it, and I hope most educators ask it. Can virtue be taught? Can virtue be taught? You know, we still talk about character development, moral education, moral development. Essentially, that's the question that the Meno is discussing, whether virtue can be taught. Now, it becomes obvious, of course, that to teach something requires, presumably, that one has some knowledge of the subject to teach. So in asking, can virtue be taught, Plato has Socrates, the principal character, has Socrates asking the intermediate question, well, what is knowledge? And in the light of that, can virtue be taught? And you'll find that the dialogue ends with a note of ambiguity. Because while, of course, the Sophists, with their rhetoric, can't teach something, and all they've got is their own relative opinions, rhetoric doesn't teach virtue, in the hands of those rather unvirtuous Sophists. But the people who should know what virtue is, outstanding, morally upright, civic leaders and parents, well, they don't seem to have been very effective at teaching virtue. Look at the kinds of kids they've got, the sons that grow up in their homes, you see. So, can virtue be taught? Now, of course, there are other variables involved in moral education, besides simply imparting knowledge of what is virtue, even what is a particular virtue, like the classic Greek virtues of temperance, courage, wisdom, as well as justice. There's more to moral development than knowing the essence of any of those virtues. And in the Meno, Plato doesn't get into the more. He does a little bit in the Republic and elsewhere. But the question is posed, and immediately we are precipitated into epistemology. Okay? Now, what I want to do, however, is to broaden the picture from the Meno, and to comment briefly about a variety of things which Plato talks about both in the Meno and in other dialogues on epistemology. You'll find both in the Meno and in the selection from the Symposium and in the selection from the Phaedo, those are the three that you're into this week, in all three of them, that distinction between knowledge and mere opinion comes through. Opinion is based on experience. Experience is basically a matter of sense perception. Sense perception of particular things in the world in which we live. And sense perception, Plato points out, as some of his predecessors had, sense perception tends to be relative. relative to the condition of the sense organs, relative to the condition and position of the object you're viewing. And of course, particular objects are constantly changing in some regards. And so the condition of the object is very significant. Sense perception, in other words, does not yield us unchanging knowledge of unchanging truths. It tends to yield a variable relative awareness of changing particulars. You see. And consequently, the accumulated opinions that we have on the basis of experience are simply not reliable. Now, in another of his dialogues, the Theaetetus, and all these dialogues are named after characters who appear, or most of them at least. In the Theaetetus, he debates various possibilities. If knowledge is not sense perception, could it be that we can make a simple qualification and say that knowledge is the truth that we gain, true opinions, not mistaken ones, but true opinions based on sense perception? Could that be the case? And the debate argues, no, even that isn't really adequate and unchanging. It's too liable to change. How do you know what is true if it's just based on sense perceptions? Well, could it be then that knowledge is true opinion based on sense experience, true opinion plus an account of why it is true? But that, of course, just opens up a whole can of worms. What sort of an account can you give other than one based on sense perception? Which would be quite circular, you see. So the question arises if all we have to go on is experience, and that yields only opinion, we have difficulty nailing it down. Or to use Plato's metaphor, tethering it. And he uses that metaphor in the Meno. Opinion, true opinion, may be all right for practical purposes like avoiding chariots while you cross the street. It may be all right for the daily tasks in the world of particulars. But it really needs tethering. That's it, like a horse. It'll wander away if it's loose. It needs tethering. And the thing to tether an opinion is dialectic. Dialectic. So no matter what sort of rhetorical tricks you pull out your opinions, the opinions still aren't firmed up, nailed down, tethered, whichever metaphor you like, unless by dialectic. Well, that just poses the question, what is dialectic? You say, what is dialectic? And you can come in it various ways. Dialectic is, well, it's thinking something through to a conclusion that's going to be true of all times and places. In other words, thinking beyond the relativities of a particular time or condition of an object. Thinking beyond the relativity of different sense organs with different degrees of sharpness at different times. Thinking beyond the relativities of sense perception to something, some truth, which is unchanging. And in speaking of dialectic, he often associates it as well with what he calls recollection, reminiscence. Because the way in which dialectic uncovers what is true is very much like the way in which you recollect something which you have forgotten. You know the way that goes. You simply don't remember meeting such and such an individual. But then as I describe the individual, tell you certain of her mannerisms, and perhaps start describing the occasion when you met her, it begins to, as we say, come back. And while it's not initially clear, you say, oh yes, now I begin to remember, to recollect. Now, dialectic has that effect, except that it's not a matter of recollecting particular experiences. There is, as a result of dialectic, an actual recall going on, as dialectic enables you to recall to mind unchanging truths which you knew in a previous existence. Yeah, you see, we'll get into this later on, but Plato believed in the pre-existence of the soul. Pre-existence of the soul. So that you come into this life with certain innate knowledge. Innate in the literal sense, inborn. You are born with certain latent ideas in your mind. You see. Latent in the sense that you're not aware of them, until the dialectic enables you to recall them. So dialectic facilitates the recollection of innate knowledge from a previous existence of the soul. Now, perhaps you're acquainted with Plato's famous cave analogy. Still talks of it. But what Plato does is, and this is in his Republic, which is not named after a character, it's about the ideal city-state. But in the Republic, he likens the soul in this life to a prisoner in a cave. Okay? The prisoner who is tied in such a way that he can only look towards the rear wall of the cave. And the light of the sun filters in. There's a fire burning in the mouth of the cave, casting a flickering light, so that shadows appear on the wall in front of the prisoner, constantly changing, never reliable. You can never really pin them down, nail them down, tether them. Okay? Meanwhile, your captors scowl, big stick in hand, walk to and fro, casting further shadows on that wall ahead. You see. The soul is a prisoner in the body. Born into this life, you are imprisoned by being born. And as a result, you're unable to see the way things are out there in the real world, as you say. All you get is flickering shadows far removed from reality. You see. A world of changing appearances, relative and unreliable. You're suffering from amnesia. I guess that was the big stick on the head. You're suffering from amnesia. You don't recall anything. Unless, of course, somebody can start probing with the right questions dialectically to elicit some awareness, you see. And recollection begins. And so it's possible then that a person can be freed from those chains and be able at least to turn around and get acquainted with the erstwhile captors behind and with the reality of this cave, what this is. But that's still very shadowy, you see. It's only when we are able to reach outside the cave and see things that we come to know the way things are in reality. So what Plato is depicting then is a scheme in which we have two realms of being. Okay? Two realms of being. A realm of physical particulars, a realm of universal truths, reality, okay? Universal truths. Yeah, this is what we have to know. This is simply the arena of opinion. And somehow or other, even while we're in this life, we have to engage in a dialectic which enables us to think up there, rather than being simply confined to particulars down there. Okay? This takes dialectic. Stuck in the cave, all you can do is to engage in face-saving rhetoric. So in the Meno, you find that Plato talks of knowing by recollection the unchanging universal essence of something, like the very essence of virtue. Oh, recollection may be evoked by considering particular cases, particular examples. But dialectic is not empirical generalization across a lot of particular cases. Empirical generalization doesn't get you to the essence of the thing, only to similarities, some of which may be very incidental and unnecessary. So you have to get beyond the sense perception and the empirical generalization to thinking abstractly, in abstraction from all of those particulars, about the essential nature of things. Dialectic, then, typically, will start with a hypothesis about the essence of something. In the Republic, as I mentioned before, the question is, what is justice? So the discussion starts with hypotheses as to what justice is that are offered by Thrasymachus and others along the way, you see. And it is by the analysis of those hypotheses about the essence of justice that finally the dialectic gets closer and closer to the truth about justice. In the Phaedo, you'll find that Plato uses the concept of equality as an example. How do you judge that two sticks, or two pieces of chalk, or for that matter, two sticks of so-called dry ink, or do they call this liquid chalk? Well, whichever it is, are equal in length? You see. What is it? By looking at them. No. No, you cannot say they're equal in length unless you already have a concept of equality to know what you're saying when you say they're equal in length. In other words, a judgment like these two sticks are equal in length presupposes a non-empirical concept of equality, which may be elicited by talking about two sticks being equal in length, but is not, as such, an empirical property. No two physical things are ever exactly the same, after all. So the example there is of things being equal in length, all right. Now, it's with that in mind that we have this print-off from Plato's Republic. Oh, let me mention one other. In the Symposium, you'll find he distinguishes between beauty, the essence of beauty, the ideal beauty, capital B, and particular beautiful things. Okay? Particular beautiful things are objects of sense perception. Beauty, the ideal, capital B, is grasped, as he puts it, by the eye of the mind. You see with your mind.